Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, dramatic shift in global history. We're going to see how a pretty straightforward quest for trade goods, spices and textiles, somehow erupted into a high-stakes, incredibly violent battle royale for a global empire. So, let's jump right in. To really wrap our heads around this era, we have to start with a core question. How exactly did chasing after pepper and silk lead to 2 entire centuries of colonial rule? Honestly, it helps to think of this whole period not just as a dusty timeline of dates, but as an escalating, cutthroat tournament. 5 global powers stepped onto the Indian subcontinent looking for a payday, but only one would walk away as the absolute sovereign. Every great story needs an inciting incident, right? Well, ours happens in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. When the Ottoman Turks took this incredibly vital city, they essentially slammed the door shut on the traditional land routes that connected Europe to Asia. Moving goods overland suddenly became a logistical nightmare and wildly expensive. This one event triggered a frantic European dash to the seas. They literally had to find a new path to the wealth of the East, even if it meant risking it all on terrifying, uncharted waters. And what were they risking their lives for? Well, these weren't just your everyday items. We're talking about the ultimate economic prizes of the era. Europeans were absolutely desperate for Indian textiles, things like muslin and calico, and spices. Pepper was literally worth its weight in gold back then. Add in indigo and precious stones, and you've got a financial incentive so massive, it pushed explorers straight into the unknown. Then, in 1498, Vasco da Gama cracked the code. He successfully navigated the Cape of Good Hope and hit Calicut. And man, once that sea route was open, the floodgates broke. Within a single century, the English, the Dutch, and eventually the French all spun up their own massive East India companies and arrived on the scene. Almost overnight, the Indian subcontinent became incredibly crowded with hungry, heavily armed competitors.
Let's look at the first mover, competitor one, the Portuguese. Their strategy right out of the gate was relentless. It was defined by something called the Blue Water Policy, driven by Francisco de Almeida. Now, the Portuguese weren't actually trying to conquer huge chunks of inland India at first. Instead, they focused entirely on securing absolute naval supremacy in the Indian Ocean. They basically turned the open ocean into their own private toll road, using the Cartaz system. It was an unavoidable naval pass. If an Indian ship wanted to trade, they had to buy Portuguese permission. If not, their ship was getting sunk. No questions asked.
But that early lead faded pretty quickly. You see, Portugal was a small country, so they just didn't have the manpower or the resources to sustain a massive global empire. Add in some rampant administrative corruption and a very heavy-handed religious intolerance, like the brutal Inquisition in Goa, which seriously alienated the local population, and they just overextended themselves. After suffering defeats by Indian powers like the Marathas and facing fresh European rivals, they were effectively knocked out of the race for political supremacy. Okay, moving on to competitor 2, the Dutch. The Dutch took a completely different approach. They were, arguably, the most commercially efficient and wealthy corporation in human history at the time. But their focus was incredibly narrow. They wanted an absolute ironclad monopoly on the spice trade, period. And because the most valuable spices were over in Indonesia, that's where they put their energy. For the Dutch, India wasn't the main prize. It was mostly just a stepping stone to supply their Indonesian operations. But, as you know, you can't hang out in the neighborhood without bumping into the neighbors. In 1759, at the Battle of Badara, the British dealt a decisive blow to the Dutch. Since the Dutch were already pivoting so heavily toward Indonesia anyway, they just decided to cut their losses and gracefully, well, sort of gracefully, step out of the Indian political game. And then there were two. The heavyweights enter the ring. Britain versus France. Now, the British East India Company, they were brilliant at logistics. They systematically locked down what were called presidency towns. We're talking Surat in 1613, Madras in 1639, Bombay in 1668, and Calcutta by 1690. Notice how they're perfectly spread out? By securing these very specific coastal strongholds, the British built an unbreakable, highly defensible logistical network that wrapped right around the entire Indian coastline. In that logistical network created a massive structural advantage. Let's compare our two heavyweights. The British East India Company operated as an autonomous, incredibly profitable private enterprise with just immense financial backing. They could pivot and make decisions on the fly. On the flip side, the French East India Company was constantly bogged down by the French crown. They had inconsistent government support and basically had to rely on the sheer personal ambition of their governor, Dupleix.
who was brilliant, sure, but severely under-resourced. Which brings us to the climax of our tournament, the Carnatic Wars. These wars really unfolded in 3 escalating steps. Step 1 was literally just a European conflict, the 7 Years' War, spilling over into India, which ended in a stalemate. Step 2 got much messier. Both the British and the French started actively interfering in local Indian succession disputes in Hyderabad and the Carnatic region. They were essentially using Indian rulers as proxies. And then Step 3? That was the final, devastating, all-out military showdown between the 2 European giants. That showdown peaked right here, 1760, the Battle of Wandiwash. This was the ultimate knockout punch. The British decisively crushed the French military forces. Now, the later Treaty of Paris did let the French keep their trade factories, but it permanently destroyed any political ambitions they had in India. The British were officially the last ones standing. So we have to ask the million-dollar question. Why did the British actually win? Well, it wasn't just one lucky break. The keys to their victory were multifaceted. First, they had unmatched naval superiority to protect their supply lines. Second, their sheer commercial success gave them vast financial resources to actually fund massive armies. Third, while France was dealing with internal turmoil, Britain had solid political stability back home. They also perfectly leveraged those strategic coastal locations we looked at earlier. And finally, and perhaps most lethally, they used masterful, sometimes ruthless diplomacy, exploiting the fragmented rivalries of local Indian states to absolutely divide and conquer. Take a look at this final scorecard of our historical tournament. It perfectly sums up how these differing strategies played out. The Portuguese mixed trade with religion, and they declined. The Dutch focused purely on the spice commerce, and they left for Indonesia. The French tried diplomacy and politics without the bankroll to support it, and faced defeat. But the British? They combined a dominant navy with massive financial power, evolving from mere traders into the ultimate rulers of an empire. Let's step back and look at the legacy of conquest. This tournament didn't just end with a winner. It forever altered the destiny of the Indian subcontinent. The impacts were incredibly complex. On the economic front, Europeans introduced new crops like tobacco and potatoes, but this was followed by a massive, devastating drain of wealth. Politically, ancient Indian states were completely swallowed up by new European colonial boundaries. Militarily, modern artillery and highly disciplined infantry became the new standard. And socially, this era brought the printing press and the gradual spread of Western education. So, how do experts make sense of all this today? Let's check out how history views the era. Historians generally analyze this monumental shift through 3 very distinct lenses. The colonial view often frames the European arrival as the dawn of modernization and new infrastructure. Conversely, the nationalist view marks this exact period as the tragic start of deep, systemic colonial exploitation and a total loss of sovereignty. Meanwhile, the Marxist view analyzes this era as the forced integration of the Indian economy into the broader global capitalist system. Each perspective gives us a vital piece of the puzzle, which leaves us with a final thought to ponder as we wrap up today's explainer. When you look back at those ships racing across the oceans, the cutthroat monopolies, and the battles on the coastlines, was this era a triumph of strategic and commercial brilliance, or the devastating inception of global exploitation? It's a massive historical debate, but understanding exactly how it all started